We'll get you one. I'm going to mute this one for just a second. Next week is our Sunday service, or our singing service, but the following week we will begin to look at the minor prophets. And I enjoy the minor prophets. I've enjoyed the study thus far that we've gone through in the survey, and I hope you have as well. But the minor prophets, there is practical information in them for you and I. But there's also practical information in the major prophets as well as the rest of the Old Testament. But in Daniel, there are several lessons that you and I can gain from a study of the book of Daniel. And we're not going to be able to look at all of them tonight. And I will tell you that we're not going to try to go in depth in all the symbolism that is in Daniel. We're going to touch on it, but then you can do some study on your own because you can do study on, and that I've done in the past few weeks as I've been preparing for this, and you can see where history points out where history, let me say this a different way, where the prophecies in Daniel have come true throughout history. And so if you want to do some of that on your own, if you have questions about a lot of those, I'll try to do my best to answer them or point you in the right direction to find that information. The book of Daniel is split in, you could almost split it into two parts. Chapters 1 through 6, and then chapters 7 through 12. Chapters 1 through 6 gives a little bit of history, and there are a couple prophecies or dreams that are had in chapters 1 through 6 that Daniel interprets, and then those prophecies are fulfilled. Get over into chapter 7 through 12, and Daniel begins to have visions, and he sees things, and those kindly point to the future and point to events that in Daniel's time, these events were going to happen. In our time, most of them have already happened. Chapter 12, and we'll talk about it a little bit further as we get over there, depending on how you interpret chapter 12, and I believe it's pointing to a time that is not yet come. I believe it's pointing to the last days, to the day of judgment, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get there. Daniel is one of the first groups of captives that is taken to Babylon. And he is selected along with others because of their looks, because of their intelligence, because of the ability to be trained and taught the ways of the Babylonians in order that they may then serve the king. Now we read in chapter 1 that they were trained for 3 years before they were taken before the king. So they were taught the ways of the Babylonians. And in fact, their names were changed. And Daniel's name was Belteshazzar. But they changed his name, or his name was changed. Remember also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are also 3 friends of Daniel. Their names were also changed, but that was the Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego was their Babylonian names. Their Hebrew names or their Jewish name was Hananiah was Shadrach, Mishael was Meshach, and Azariah was Abednego. Now, again, what the point of that is to try to conform them to the ways of the Babylonians, to take away their Jewish history and to have them to conform. Even the food they were given was, they were trying to conform them, and then to as though they were Babylonians. And in chapter 1 we read about Daniel, and the king allotted them the food, that the delicacies and the good food, but Daniel didn't want to do that. Daniel wanted to remain faithful. Some of the food that they were being offered, God had deemed unclean. And so Daniel didn't want to defile himself. So he makes a request. And then as he makes this request, the one that is in charge of him says, no, I can't do that, because if something happens to you, I could be killed. But Daniel says, give me a test. Try us for 10 days. Give us just the vegetables and the things that we want and the water, and let's see how it goes. And so they did that. And they were in better shape after the 10 days than they were to begin with. What do you see there? Do you see God working? We do. You see the providence of God there working. And you see Daniel's faithfulness there. And you see Daniel being willing to take a stand for what he believed in. There's a lesson that we can gain from the book of Daniel. Don't be afraid to take a stand for what you believe in. Now, notice in verse 17 of Daniel chapter 1, it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Remember, the Babylonians thought that they were training and teaching them in the ways of the Babylonians. But in reality, where did their knowledge come from? Where did their wisdom come from? It came from God. And Daniel's ability to interpret these dreams and understand these visions, that was something that God gave him the ability to do. Then later on, in fact in chapter 2, it's going to come in handy. And we get over into chapter 2 and we read about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And Nebuchadnezzar sees this image and he has this dream, but it almost appears that when he has that dream, that he can't really remember everything that happened in the dream. And this dream bothers him. And so he goes and he calls his magicians and his astrologers to him and says, you tell me what the dream is and you interpret the dream for me. Tell me what it means. Well, their first response was, well, tell us what the dream is. You know, you need to tell us what the dream is first, and then we'll interpret. But Nebuchadnezzar shows a little bit of wisdom here. He says, you know, if I tell you the dream, then you're just going to make up something so that I don't cut you into pieces. Because Nebuchadnezzar's plan was, if you can't tell me the dream, if you can't tell me the interpretation of it, I'm going to cut you into pieces and turn your homes into an ash heap. Well, lo and behold, his astrologers and his magicians could not tell him the dream. They couldn't interpret it. And so he gives the order for them to be killed, to all the wise men. And this order also included Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because as the guards were going through and killing these folks, then Daniel says, you know, what's going on? And then Daniel says, well, I can interpret that dream. But I want you to notice something that Daniel does. In verse 17 through 19 in chapter 2, then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they may seek mercies from God, from the God of heaven, concerning this secret. so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Does that sound like to you that Daniel asked him to go to God in prayer and ask God to give him wisdom? It does to me. You go and you pray that I'm going to be successful. And again, here is another lesson. Daniel's asking them to go pray, and the power of prayer, the strength of prayer that you and I have, that God will grant us the things that we need. And this is exactly what Daniel was doing. He was asking his companions to pray for him. And then as you go on down through and you get into verse 31, Daniel goes before the king. He asked to go before the king. And he tells the king the dream. And he describes the image. And, the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly iron and partly clay. And then the stone that come out of the mountain and crushed that image. And then Daniel describes that dream. And he interprets that dream to him and tells him that his kingdom is going to fall. And that he will not always have a kingdom. And that great stone was actually God's providence, or God destroying his kingdom. Do you remember God raised up Babylon for a purpose? God raised up Babylon so that she could defeat Israel and destroy Jerusalem and to correct the Israelites. This is again another fulfillment of that prophecy. And as we go through chapter 2, you can see that, there were other powers that came to be following Babylon. Daniel interprets that, says, Babylon, or King Nebuchadnezzar, you are that head of gold. But then there will be another kingdom that will follow that. And you go back into history and you see there was another kingdom that followed that, the Medo-Persian Empire. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. And then the Grecian Empire followed that. And then the Roman Empire followed that. And then in reality, as we get a little bit further over, we'll see that from the Grecian Empire, it split into 4 other empires, or 3 other empires. But we'll talk about that a little bit further. But the important thing here is that Daniel interprets that dream. And he's given this ability from God. And then because of God granting him these abilities, he is promoted with the king. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 46 through 49. And I want you to notice what Nebuchadnezzar does here. King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts and made him a ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar realizes who God is. Daniel interprets this dream, and Daniel gives the credit to God. He doesn't take the credit, but he gives the credit to God. In verse 49, Daniel also petitions the king. He mentions to the king, look at verse 49. Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So you see here again, God's providence is working. And then we get into chapter 3, and we see, to me, it's a demonstration of faith. Here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is a few years later, chapter 3 is. And remember what Nebuchadnezzar had just said. Your God is the God of kings. Your God is the God of gods. But now Nebuchadnezzar puts a great image and decrees that everybody should worship this image. You hear the music playing, you fall down. No matter what you're doing, you fall down and you worship this image. And we know this story probably almost as well as we know the one we'll talk about a little bit later when Daniel's in the lion's den. But here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down to this image. And Nebuchadnezzar brings them in, and he gives them a second chance. I'm going to give you another chance, he says, and if you'll fall down, and they say, we don't need another chance. We're not going to do it. And here we see their faith. The faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they say, Nebuchadnezzar says, who's going to be able to deliver you out of this fiery furnace? And their response is, if God chooses to deliver us from this fiery furnace, He can. If He doesn't choose to, then it's still okay, because we're going to remain faithful. And so, and this infuriates Nebuchadnezzar. And what does he do? 7 times hotter than it was before. The men that bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they take and throw them into the fiery furnace, the fire consumes them. But it seems like almost immediately after they are thrown into this fiery furnace, what happens? Nebuchadnezzar looks in and he sees not 3 men, but 4 men walking around unbound. And he says the 4th looks like the Son of Man. And so what happens? He calls out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and tells them to come out. Their clothes didn't even smell smoky. The hair on their head was not singed. Again, their faith in God protected them. Their faith in God saved them. And again, Nebuchadnezzar realizes. Look what he says in verse 28 of Daniel chapter 3. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent His angels and delivered His servants who trusted in Him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. And then he goes on in verse 29 and he makes a decree. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. That's Nebuchadnezzar. It says there's no other God that can deliver like this. But then it doesn't seem like long until Nebuchadnezzar has another dream in chapter 4. And in chapter 4 he sees this vision of this high tree. And then this cut down. And well, let's begin reading in Daniel chapter 4, verse 10. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. As I was looking, behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and it was high, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached the heaven, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth. And then skip down to verse 13. And I saw in the vision of my head while on my bed that there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. And he cried aloud, chop down the tree and cut off its branches and strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. And let the beast get out from under it and the birds from its branches. And again, this is a vision. And then Daniel interprets that vision. And what does he tell Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar, you are the tree. And then he goes on and tells Nebuchadnezzar that he is going to end up eating grass as an ox, and that the stump will remain there. And that symbolized that once Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, and again he has put himself above God, that his kingdom would still be there for a little while. Until Nebuchadnezzar learned that God was in control. That was the purpose here for Nebuchadnezzar. Look in verse 34. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to the heavens, and my understanding returned. Remember, he was as an ox in the field. His hair grew long like feathers of an eagle. And he says, my understanding came back. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored Him who lives forever. He came to the understanding that God is in control. And then in chapter 5, we read about the feast of Belshazzar. And now he has taken over the kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar. He is now the ruler. And it's about 20-some years following the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And what I want to look at here in chapter 4 is the contribution that different ones bring to this feast that Belshazzar is having. Belshazzar's contribution was wine, fulfilling the lust of the flesh. That was his contribution. Look in verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the kings and his lords, let me get my page turned over, and wives and concubines might drink from them, taking those things that they had taken from the temple, and now they're using them to drink from. So that is his contribution to this feast. God's contribution was the handwriting on the wall. You know, we say, you see the writing on the wall, and that kind of takes us back to, a sign that's coming. And this is another sign from God. And notice what happens to Belshazzar in verse 6. The king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that his joints of his hip were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. He was scared because he didn't understand. And then in chapter 26, verse 26 of chapter 5, Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall. And it says, God has numbered your kingdom, and it is finished. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Remember, we mentioned the Medes and Persians a while ago. Drop down to verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The fulfillment of that prophecy, the fulfillment of that vision was almost immediate. And you know what's interesting, I've done a little study. Babylon's walls were about 25 feet wide. They were 40 feet tall, making them difficult to breach. But under one part of the wall, the river, waters flowed underneath. And the Medes diverted the Euphrates River and lowered the water level so that they were able to wade through the water and go underneath the walls and overtake the city. But what was going on? Notice it said that very night. when they had been drinking and partying, what happened? They lost their kingdom. They were drunk, and they lost their kingdom. Isaiah says in Isaiah 21:9, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. That prophecy that Isaiah made about the destruction, it had fallen. And then we get into chapter 6, and we see Daniel still rising in power, and here Darius is now king, and he sets up governors and satraps or magistrates, as some translations might say. And Daniel was one of these governors, but then Daniel excelled above all of them. And again, that's God working. You know, Daniel reminds me of Joseph in Egypt. Joseph went from being a captive to second in Egypt. And that's almost what Daniel has done here. And because of that, there was jealousy and envy of the others. And so they plot against Daniel. They know Daniel's character. Those that plot against him know how he is. They know that he prays constantly. And the plot is made, and they convince Darius to set up a rule, a law, that anyone caught praying would be killed. What does Daniel do? Daniel continues to go and do what he always did. He prayed. Even though he knew this plot, even though he knew what they were going to do. And remember, when they come to the king and they tell him, well, you know, we've seen Daniel praying to his God, and you said that he's got to be thrown into the lion's den. Darius stayed up all night trying to figure out a way around all of this, but he couldn't. And we know what happened. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and Darius couldn't sleep all night because he was worried about Daniel. And he goes to the lion's den the next morning, calls down. Do you think he may have had an inkling that God might protect him? I don't think he knew that he would. I don't know that Daniel knew that God would protect him. But he trusted God. But the point is, even under persecution, even under the threat of death, Daniel remained faithful. And that's what you and I need to make sure, the lesson that we get out of this, that we remain faithful. No matter what's going on around us, we need to remain faithful. Darius gets to the lion's den, and what happens? Daniel is unharmed. God has shut the mouths of the lions and saved Daniel. And then we get into we move into the next section, chapter 7. And again, we're not going to try to go through and explain all of these prophecies. I'm going to hit some of the main ones and then give you a little bit of the history, because we're quickly running out of time. But I want you, if you want to do a little more study on this, and as I was studying this, I was thinking, what good does this do for me to know all of these things? I look back in history and I can see all these things that God said was going to happen. I can see them happening. What good does it do? It should strengthen me to know that when God says He's in control, then God is in control. And that what God says is going to happen. Whether I like it or not, it's going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar didn't like what he was told by Daniel. Belshazzar didn't like what he was told by Daniel. But they still happened because God is in control. And in chapter 7, Daniel has a dream. And he sees the 4 beasts. And those 4 beasts, you know, he describes them. The 4th beast, it's almost like he can't describe it because it's so terrible. The first beast was a lion with eagle's wings. And Daniel interprets that as being Babylon. And it's interesting, if you look, Babylon in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 7 is called a lion. And in Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 3, Babylon is referred to as an eagle. And then we see the bear. Then we see the bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. And then Daniel interprets that as the Medo-Persian Empire. And the 3 ribs in its mouth, the Medo-Persian Empire, according to history, had 3 main conquests. They conquered Babylon, they conquered Lydda, and they conquered Egypt. And then there is the third beast was a leopard with 4 wings. And Daniel interprets that as the Grecian Empire. And one unique thing about the Grecian Empire, their conquests were done within 4 years. And then he also talks about that being divided. And after the death of Alexander the Great, there were 4 military leaders, not Alexander the Great's descendants, but there were 4 military leaders that the power or the kingdom was divided into. But then we also see in chapter 7 the Ancient of Days sitting in judgment. And he's judging all of these nations. And then as we get into chapter 8, we see Daniel's vision again about the ram and the goat and the small horns, which also represents these same kingdoms along with the Roman kingdom. And it shows that there's going to be another kingdom that's going to rise. And in Daniel chapter 8, verse 24, he says, "His power shall be mighty," referring to the Grecian Empire. "But not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, and also the holy people." And again, that is a reflection of the persecution against the Christians, or against God's people. Daniel, after seeing this, look in Daniel chapter 8, verse 27. "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I arose about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood that." Then as we go on into chapter 7, or chapter 9, we see more stuff about Darius, and we're the first year of King Darius. And Daniel again is praising God and praying to God. And in his prayer, he recognizes their sinfulness. He recognizes that Israel has fallen away. But then Gabriel comes and helps Daniel to understand. And then we drop down into chapters 10 through 12, and Daniel has another vision. And let's look at that. I forgot what verse that is. Daniel chapter 10, beginning in verse 5. "I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold and of Uphaz, and his body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms, the feet were burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like a voice of a multitude." And then we get into verse 12. "Your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. And behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the king of Persia." And then you drop down to verse 20. "And then he said, 'Do you know why I have come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia.' And when I have gone forth indeed, the prince of Greece will come. This is an angel from God. This is describing an angel from God. But then he talks about also in the latter days there will come a kingdom that will last forever. After all of these other kingdoms that's talked about here in the book of Daniel, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Grecian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and the Roman Empire, after all of these have fallen, there's going to come another kingdom that will never pass away, that will last for all eternity. And we look in chapter 12 and we see that that is that kingdom of God that will last forever, that will never pass away. Some think that refers to Israel. Some commentators say that chapter 12 refers to Israel. And I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I believe when you read that and you look at what that's describing, I think it's describing the kingdom of God. And then chapter 12 describes the day of judgment. In chapters 11 and 12, Daniel talks about some numbers: 1,290 days, 1,260 days, and then, but I don't think they're literal days. I think it is a period of time. Just like when we get over into Revelations, there's numbers that are used in Revelations, and they are periods of time. He even uses the number 1,335. So there's 3 different numbers that he uses. But those are not, I don't think those are literal days. In a nutshell, that's what the book of Daniel is about. If you want to sum it up in just a few words, we see what happens to the captivity, to the captives that are taken to Babylon. But then we see that God has not forgotten His people, that God's plan is still in effect. God's plan is still going to come to fruition. And no matter what we do, no matter what they did, no matter what they tried to do, God's plan was still going to come about. God's kingdom was going to come about, and there would be salvation in God's kingdom. The important thing is that we now, from this side, we can look back and we can see. But the important thing is that we are a part of God's kingdom. We are a part of God's church. We talked about this morning in our lesson, which chair are you sitting in? The invitation is still open. If you're sitting in the wrong chair, then you can change. You can, if you're in the straying chair, you can come back and God will forgive you. If you're in the chair where those that are lost, you can become a Christian and you can receive salvation. You can receive the salvation that Daniel talks about. If you're willing to repent and to change your lives. If you're subject to invitation tonight, I encourage you to come while we stand and while